Hi, my name is Miles, and today I'm going to show you how to paint a landscape with gouache.
To start, you'll want to draw your landscape on something like acrylic or mixed media paper. Take a ruler and measure about 1 centimeter from each side, mark it, and then draw a line across your page. This will be used in our taping later as a reference of where we want our border. Now, I am taping each corner like this, and it's important to tape your pages down when working with painting mediums that require water. Taping your corners like this reduces any buckling that might happen during the painting process or during the drawing process. Now we are adding 1 to 2 pieces depending on the thickness of your masking tape or painter's tape. I am adding 2 to make sure that no water seeps through on the back side of the painting and to make sure that this piece of paper is flush with my foam core board. On to setting up our palettes. If you feel like you've added too much paint, don't worry. Any dried gouache paint like watercolor can be revitalized with a little bit of water. The gouache pigments used in this color palette are white, gray, yellow ochre, medium yellow, dark green, emerald green, leaf green, viridian, sky blue, blue lake, and burnt sienna. After taping, the next step in the painting process is creating a tone by making a wash of blue. I am using sky blue here with about 1:4 ratio of water to pigment. I am taking the brush and going across and up and down the page to make sure there is an even distribution of the paint. Once this layer dries, I will go in with a little bit of white and a little bit of water and start shaping out my clouds. I'm using white for the highlights, the brightest part of the clouds, and for the darker parts, I'm using sky blue with a mix of white in that as well. I'm avoiding using any gray in the clouds at this point because I'm a little worried that it's going to overpower the color palette and take away from our landscape. So we're just going to keep it light, bright, and blue. Next, taking a little yellow ochre, we are starting on what is known as an underpainting. Like toning, underpainting creates a base for the other layers to sit upon. And these underpainting layers are essential in creating a sense of depth to make scenic views like this less flat and more realistic. We finished working on the brighter part of the grass. Now we are working on our mid-tone using emerald green, leaf green, yellow, a little yellow ochre, and white. We will be mixing those together and creating that medium tone that will sit on the grass. Also notice I'm using a little less water than I was before. How you want to paint with gouache is working thin to thick, and pigment-wise, you want to start with brighter colors and work darker. For foliage, I use viridian, and I am going along the underside of the bushes, the trees, and giving them a bit of shape as well. Another tip is if you have a stray line, you can take a paper towel and blot off where you started painting. As long as the under layer is dry, nothing else should pick up. For our dirt road underpainting, I'm using burnt sienna, viridian, and a little gray mixture. And I am going to layer that very lightly where I want that path to sit. Mixing burnt sienna, emerald green, dark green, and a little blue lake, I use this as the base layer for the trunks for our trees. Once again, I am using our longer flat brush. I'm mixing leaf green and yellow together, and I'm using that for the brighter parts of our foliage. We want it to blend in enough with the background that it's cohesive, and yet bright enough for it to stand out on its own. Now that the grass is dry, we are going back again and layering on top. Starting off with that leafy green mixture that we used for the trees in those very bright patched areas that I mapped out before. And finally, before moving on, adding a bit of the blue lake on top of the leaf green, just to create a little bit of that bluer look in the atmosphere. I am mixing leaf green, white, and a little bit of yellow. And I'm again going over those areas, trying to bring out the highlights, the lighter parts of the grass. If you feel like that isn't bright enough, you can always add a bit more yellow or a bit more white to create more contrast on the lighter parts of the grass. And here you can see I am getting those very bright yellow-green highlights just at the top, brushing it across. And I'm doing the same with a darker green along the ends, and once again in the back. I want to show you a closer detail of the brush that I'm using. It is a round brush, and I'm just barely using the tips of the bristles. You could see that they were spread out from all the paint that was in it. I'm using the darker green and just barely brushing the top of the surface to help create those darker patches, those shadowier, layered bits of the grass, making sure all the areas feel cohesive and complete. While the layering on the landscape is done as far as it can be, I go into adding a medium tone for the foliage. Adding a bit more of the darker green that we used earlier, just to add a bit more shadow throughout the foliage, and then I am stippling along the top as well, still leaving a bit of that lighter green. While I let those trees sit for a bit, I'm going back to working on the sky. I am again working with sky blue and adding deeper, darker layers around the trees, around the clouds to create a stronger outline. And once I'm satisfied with that outline, I will again go back and create those stronger highlights with the white paint at the tops of the clouds and add a few minor details where there were none before. I'm also adding a nice outline where the horizon line is and then blending that into the sky. And now we go back to our trees. I'm going back with the leaf green to just add a few smaller little leaves on this outside since we painted over that. And going in with a dark green right at the base of the shrub. And once again, it is a back and forth between the medium tones, the shadow, and the highlight until you are satisfied with your outcome. Finally, we work on our dirt pathway. I'm starting off with sienna, a little white, and a little yellow to brighten up that burnt sienna color we have. Add that as the medium tone or base layer before working on top with yellow and white, blending it through, and then using the burnt sienna mix from earlier, adding gray, and creating that shadow. The last thing to do with a landscape painting is to do any small fine details. In this painting, I'm using a small round brush to add little white flowers and little yellow flowers in clusters. I am doing the highlights on blades of grass that I feel are very important to the painting, something to help bring a little bit of contrast in areas, adding more contrast to the tops of my bushes on the tops of the trees, and then finally adding our last details on the clouds now that our sky is dry, just to finish those areas off. Once everything is dry, you can start peeling off your tape. Do so very carefully as to avoid tearing or a potential ripping of paint off your canvas. Once you remove that final piece of tape, you can erase the remaining marks made earlier, any sketch marks from the drawing process, and so on. Another tip, to remove any excess eraser shavings, you can actually dust them off with a dry paintbrush. And here is the final results! If you find that your piece, like mine, is kind of curved, or if it's warping, let it sit under something heavy like a book for roughly 24 to 48 hours. And as for decorating, you can either keep the white edges, trim them off, have it mounted on mounting board, put it in a framed display, and showcase it around your house.